I really want to play some SoloDark. And I do concede that the retort, well, why don't you, is a perfectly acceptable response to this statement. I kind of want to prepare for the play a little bit, or rather, prepare for the actual solo campaign. Because while I think it's perfectly viable to just jump right into a game of SoloDark, all the elements, all the tools are there, there is also the fact that a lot of people that play solo games have an awful lot of books on their shelves that very rarely get put to the amount of use that they could reasonably sustain. And so I'd like to use some of those resources. Not because I have to, but because I really kind of want to. So let's get the ball rolling by creating a rough outline of a world and 3 distinct adventuring locations, each with their own little unique ShadowDark touch. Hello friends, Anderson here, welcome to SoloDark, the campaign prep for a ShadowDark solo campaign. I am referring to it as SoloDark because that is the name of the official solo supplement. Yes, there is one that has been out for a little while and that you can grab easily off of the Arcane library. The overall system, ShadowDark, should hopefully be somewhat familiar as it's the, I think, product of the year in the RPG space right now, and at least in my opinion, deservedly so. And I've been meaning to play it for a little while. I had been kind of holding off on the Cursed Scroll 4, which has some expanded hex crawling rules, but I don't think I want to wait any longer. I just want to create a couple of cornerstones, touchstones for us to jump in with a little party of misfits and experience the game through some solo campaign play. Now, what I specifically want to do with this preparation video series is to create 3 distinct adventuring locations with their respective adventuring hooks as well, using resources like the Tome of Adventure Design, some components from Worlds Without Number, a few random tables from the Books of Random Tables, the Ultimate Toolbox, and probably also more specialized generator source books like Into the Cess and Citadel and Into the Weird and Wild. Specifically, what I want to create is a city-style location, a kind of a wilderness crawl location, and a sort of dungeon location. For the wilderness and dungeon locations, I also want to give them a little like sanctuary for the wilderness and last outpost of civilization hamlet, sort of in the vicinity of whatever dungeon we can come up with. Because then we can make a little bit of a random table again, where 1 to 2 is the city, 3 to 4 is the wilderness, and 5 to 6 is our dungeon, which is where we first encounter our party when we start playing. So easy said, easy done. Here is our little table that we can keep in mind for future reference. And we can also just use it to determine what we'll actually be starting to flesh out first using our various tools at our disposal. So what are we going to start with? 2, we will start with the city. However, before we start with the city, there is a bit of overhead I want to milk out of the ShadowDark concept itself. Because one of the things that the game does quite a bit is light management and making the darkness itself have a tangible impact in the gameplay. And the darkness itself also almost is a bit of a character in the game. The ShadowDark, this real primordial darkness that is almost like a bit of a sentient, malicious creature that is not just your regular old dark when you blow out the candle before bed, but the one that sort of lurks in the dangerous places and is maybe also what makes them dangerous. And I really like that concept and I want to run with it a little bit. So my idea for the world building here was to lean into the ShadowDark aspect a bit and make the ShadowDark a thing. So let's start with the world, which as yet does not have a name. And then we begin with the ShadowDark. So in the context of this world building, I think the ShadowDark is almost like an entity, sort of really like a malignant semi-consciousness that either willfully or instinctively acts almost like an undercurrent of major evil, sort of coordinated activities that happen in this world. And that isn't to say it controls like all evildoers. I think there is a distinct element of personal freedom and agency and the will to be your own boss in a way in a lot of evil aligned creatures in fantasy games, so that wouldn't really work. But I think the ShadowDark can act as a sort of linchpin in the shadow behind certain activities in the world, trying to link some champions of evil that it is aware of and maybe creating through manipulations and indirect action some major evil uprisings and plots and the like that otherwise might not happen quite the same way. So it's an influence, it's the force that is hidden in the shadows behind the true darkness and kind of pulls the strings from there, even though it never really acts as an entity or an individual. I think it's too abstract for that. It's really like a universal force that exists in this world. So we'll mark it down as a universal force of malignancy that often unites otherwise separate agents of evil into a major world-threatening event. I don't think it does it with a great amount of frequency. I think it ebbs and flows, and in between those major world-threatening events, there can be generations where nothing really happens. So not constant, it ebbs and flows, often lying in wait for generations, and I think if we want to think about the events as they happen in the world, we can maybe also extrapolate that some forces in the world have inferred that this force, this darkness in the shadow behind the evil activities exists, and that if they monitor, for instance, the ebb and flow of the ShadowDark, sort of like the Council of Elrond in the Lord of the Rings, they may have given the actual rise of the darkness and some champions arising and something getting put together a name and called it a darkening. So a major threat event is called a darkening. And I think in this world it will be a familiar term, but not with the entirety of the meaning. So people will say we live in darkening times, or the times of darkening are coming to fruition again, or something of the sort, but they won't really be associating it with the whole story. There's only probably like a handful, like a small cabal of agents that keep this knowledge, and that whenever a darkening happens, they have their work cut out trying to find a counterweight, trying to forge like an alliance of, well, for lack of a better term, goods, even though it might also involve the more freedom-loving, evil-aligned forces. But maybe it's also a situation where the longer there is of a time between darkenings, the less they're being taken seriously, a bit like in Game of Thrones when the Night Watch says the others are coming and everyone says like they don't exist. So already we can kind of play a little bit with the world building, and we can actually maybe make another table here, which again maybe 3 lines, which just lets us decide how long ago was the most recent darkening. So 1 to 2 is a generation, 3 to 4 is over a century, and 5 to 6 is in time out of mind. And that also kind of would determine the response of the world to these perhaps initially isolated looking events, and maybe even indicate a little bit of how many of these watchers are potentially even left that keep an eye on things, or whether it's just over time descended into there's almost nobody left who's aware that the ShadowDark is a thing and that a darkening is coming up and that the world needs to pull together again. I don't really want to make it like super powerful. It's not like the all-encompassing world-ending thing. It's just one of these forces that exist in this universe that are also potentially at least susceptible to being controlled. So maybe there's even like very powerful wizards that try to harness the ShadowDark for something if they ever reach that level of knowledge. Maybe some lich out there has made like a ShadowDark focus that allows them to darken places and make them, I don't know, thinking a little bit of like Dungeon Keeper here, where there's like a remote lair of some kind, and then this overlord moves in and attracts all kinds of evil creatures to their service based on the mechanic that this darkness undercurrent exists and can be sort of used as well. So it's a bit of a two-way street, but the one way, the direct way of tapping into the ShadowDark is very obscure and very, very difficult, and only the most advanced of horrendous enemies out there will be able to do such a thing. I think we can also infer another implication here for the, I guess I'll call it the light that stands against it. So first of all, I think there is an argument to be made that when this ShadowDark was maybe still a much more primeval thing that lurks out there beyond the campfire, and that acted a little bit more directly when the people of the world were still just in a more primitive states and the gods were just happening and manifesting, things like that, there's probably a very distinct like flame and fire association with good, with maybe the religion, the dominant religion here or something like that. So we can at least infer like a strong flame and fire association. We can assume that there are watchers through the ages whose numbers also ebb and flow as the darkenings slip from memory, and we can assume that the light that stands against it is not just comprised of good actors, but also those evil aligned creatures that resent control. So if they get the feeling that they're being manipulated and can be convinced accordingly, they will just instinctively oppose, and strange alliances may form. Now that, for want of a better term, is sort of the higher level world building that I wanted to engage with. Another thought I had was kind of sparked by a couple of recent fiction sources that I've read and watched and things, and that is dealing with the role of the classic adventurer in a setting like this, which can kind of go in a direction of almost like a formalized job where there's like an adventuring league and things like that, or it's really more of a reskin of a mercenary type, or almost like a tomb robber, a thief of some kind, which is more my preference. I don't really like these organized adventurer guilds for the most part. I mean, more power to you if you enjoy them. There's nothing wrong with them. There's literally no way to play this wrong. It's just a personal preference thing. I like it much more if the adventuring party is a bit of a fringe group of misfits that, for one reason or another, prefers to risk their life going out and filling bandit bounties, or retrieving items from dungeons, or robbing old barrows for some gold that they can flog in the city. So I think the justification for this is that adventurers in this world are generally transient and thus mistrusted anywhere that isn't the most major cities at any rate. They have a reputation for going into dark places and disturbing things best left alone, and they're mostly seen as mercenaries and thieves or grave robbers. I think it gives us a little bit of a vibe to work with when we place our elements in the world. So all of our three components, our city, our wilds, and our dungeon, also need a bit of a ShadowDark hook, where the dark is actually active. This is what puts them into our focus. This is why we are interested in them. They are places in this world where this darkness currently operates. Of course, we don't know whether a darkening has just happened or whether it's imminent or whatever the case is. I think the longer it's passed, the more likely it is to come back. But that's just something we determine before we start playing. We just roll how long ago the last darkening was. And the only thing we need to keep in mind for now is that we need some sort of manifestation of the ShadowDark agency, the group of evildoers or individual evildoer that is currently doing their own dark deeds while in the shadow a deeper, older darkness lurks and pulls the strings. But now for the city. Now there's a number of ways we can start this. I think the preferred method for me is to take Worlds Without Number and determine just a few higher level things about the city. So let me just grab the book and we'll have a quick look. I've already prepared a little bit of something. One of the things we can determine right away is why does the city exist, the rationale for the city's existence. That's a D12 roll. That's a 2. It's a trait nexus that has greatly prospered. Okay, that immediately opens up our ShadowDark avenue for a corrupt council of merchants ruling the city, or an undercurrent of all kinds of influences from outside coming into the city and making it very easy for cults to take root, maybe just overall decadence as well. So there's a bunch of stuff we can do with this. Somehow the phrasing has greatly prospered also makes me think it's not a very old city, or maybe the prosperity isn't very old, which again might have something to do with the darkness behind it. Maybe their prosperity is based on more of a vice trait than something very, very legitimate. So it could be a bit of an outcast place. We need to know a little bit more about it though. So let's delve a little bit deeper in. We can already have a look at who runs the city. 9, a criminal group Cat's Paw. Ah, okay. So the criminal group rules from the shadow. From the shadow. So we have a kind of a ruler that doesn't maybe have any particular power, is just a puppet, a figurehead. And the criminals are pulling the strings in the background. Do we need a significant local? Not right away, I don't think, but we can figure out a current pressing problem. And that is 8. A disguised monster is feeding on the city from within. So there is maybe our ShadowDark agent. We can probably also link the two, the criminal group. I think we can be pretty sure that our disguised monster, whatever it is, maybe a vampire, maybe a mind flayer, wherever I heard that before, is controlling the criminal group from the shadows. I don't think I want to use the story hook generator here, so this city involvement with adventurers, but interesting things the place can offer heroes is something that I'd like to at least elaborate a little on to get a bit more of a vibe on the city. 11 blessings from major clergy or high priest. Okay, that tells me that there is a strong temple presence, which is a little bit odd. So it's gotta be more of a neutral or evil kind of deity that is perhaps mistrusted or not allowed to have major religious buildings in other places. It's a bit of a special city in the sense that it maybe regards this temple as another customer, that as long as this temple pays its taxes and bribes the officials, it is welcome, whereas in other cities in this world it is not welcome. So we'll write it down as strong temple presence of a deity that is shunned in most other quote-unquote civilized areas. And naturally, that's also then where their highest official resides, because this is probably the only real major cathedral-like temple that they have. I think we can generate a name for it as well. I have a Realm Fables, kind of a basic name generation table for cities and towns. I actually like the town table here a bit more than this one. This is a bit too grandiose, already includes a bit too much information for my taste. So I think I'm just gonna roll 2 die 20 here to generate 2 components of the name. Let's let the metal die take the lead. That's a 10 and a 3. That makes it Southfall. That's not bad. So I guess if we want to place it somewhat geographically, maybe we'll allow for a little bit of a map cut out here, a little bit of a coastline here, and then we have this sort of nestled here. I think we need like a major river, and we need a sea, because it's this major trading nexus, and it's Southfall by the sea. Do we need to call it anything else? The sea, the Kell Sea, of course. So I think it gives us a pretty decent idea of what this city is like. A city of crime operating not freely, more like in a way that the crime controllers make sure that everything is going in their favor. Maybe even operating through the temple. That could be an idea. So the criminal group has temple ties. I'm not sure I want to go with like a god of thieving, but maybe it's some kind of a god of mischief or trickery, or, you know, help yourself and so help you God, or something of the sort. And it's the place where anything goes, where you can fence all your stolen tomb-robbed riches as an adventurer, where you can also lose all of that money that you made and go carousing. And it's overall probably quite an attractive place for a misfit adventuring party, if not for that lingering, disguised monster presence that is there in the shadows, using this correlation of criminal enterprise, temple, and resources coming to the city to prepare something, to do something. I think the actual plotting and whatever this creature is up to will probably not immediately affect our level 1 party at the start of the campaign, so we don't really need to worry about it right away. We just need to keep it in mind, because we might get entangled with the machinations, and then we can use something like the Tomo Adventure design to flesh it out a bit. And we can also use Realm Fables, for instance, to create this villain and give them some characteristics. Or we can use some sort of wizardry, intelligent, mighty monster random table to determine what kind of a creature it actually is. There's probably even a table in ShadowDark somewhere that lets us determine this. I admit I'm not too familiar with it yet, so before I play, I'm familiarizing myself with the tables a bit more, of course, obviously. And I think I still want to give a little bit of a look into the Cess and Citadel, this one here, to add a little bit to Southfall, because it has a few interesting mechanics for generating a city, and for that we need a hex map and a number of die 6. So I whipped up a bit of an absurd hex sheet, but it'll do the job specifically for this purpose. And we'll gather up a bunch of 6-sided dice. I don't think 4 is quite enough. We'll need a few more. I think 7 is quite sufficient for this exercise. And now we'll throw them. And we'll tidy it up a little bit. And it's already looking quite interesting, especially this cluster here. So we have an opulent part of town right next to 2 middling parts of town, and also some opulent on the fringes, which is interesting, and a rich one here and a rich one there. So this tells us a little bit about the Southfall wealth disparity, which is pretty interesting in a context of a criminal-driven city. And I think we have maybe on the fringes here, or there's some kind of leisure country homes for the crime bosses or the Catspore ruler. Similarly here, this may be somewhere where the temples are located, or maybe even in the opulent part here. This is maybe some economic center where nobody really lives of any particular standard, but where a lot of the commerce happens right in the center. So this definitely feels like the place where the action is in this town. And I think we don't need to do the next step yet, which is to create the actual dangers that are happening on a day-to-day basis in this city, where you also roll a bunch of dice and then it engages a little bit with these particular parts of town. That's not to say that these are the only existing parts of town, by the way. I think the assumption is that all the hexes that don't have a particular designation of middling, opulent, or rich are like of common, perhaps in this city's case, with a more extreme wealth disparity, even like poor standard. So we have some islands of wealth and opulence and of middling economic prowess, and the rest is probably below that. And I think what we can do now in closing is to take the ShadowDark book and maybe just generate a couple of rumors for this city that we can pick up should we start playing there. That's a D100. So we'll put the red one in the lead, generate our first rumor. That is a warband of orcs has taken over an abandoned, and I'll put it in quotation marks, keep. Might also be a manor or a poor part of town. Maybe it's more like a gang of orcs from out of town that has moved in and set up a little bit of a protection racket somewhere and is finding itself soon at odds with the powers that be, and there might be a little bit of butting of heads commencing. The next rumor is 36 fire will not light or burn within sight of the Lion Fountain. Now that is interesting. So we'll make a note here of, is this related to our ShadowDark agent, our disguised creature that is pulling strings from afar? How that's related we'll have to find out through play, but I think it's quite an interesting tell. Maybe it's not quite as obvious, maybe it's more like if you get close to the fountain, your torch starts sputtering and flickering and there's this sort of chill emanating from this fountain, and maybe we have to figure out the history of this fountain to figure out how it relates to our ShadowDark agent, but it's a nice little bit of table serendipity here. Very on theme. Next one. 22 says a captain of the guard has been taken hostage by thugs. I'm going to translate this a little bit into a more holistic event, and I'm going to say like one part of town is currently openly lawless and the corrupt guard doesn't go there anymore. I think the powers that be in the city will still try to hold up the pretense that there is law and order. So something like this is either an exception and tolerated, or it's a gang that is a bit too big for its britches at the moment and is going to be cracked down upon as well, but not by the guards, who are probably a little bit useless in Southfall. So that's our first location done and a rough sketch of our world done. This is one of the options where our campaign can start, but there is still the wilds and the dungeon area to create. So we will do that next time. I thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you then, and bye for now.